February 1942, a freezing night. On the northern coast of France, the icy winds of the English Channel howl through the darkness. It's well past midnight, and at that very moment, 12 Whitley bombers glide silently through the dark sky toward enemy territory. Inside them are 119 British paratroopers. Their mission? To carry out one of the boldest theft operations in history. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories like this here. But wait, what are these men going to steal? Gold? Secret documents? No, a single radar component. Yes, you heard that right. 119 men are about to risk their lives for one piece of metal. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? But by the end of this story, you'll understand that the small part stolen that night was important enough to change the course of World War II. It would save the lives of thousands of British and American pilots, and perhaps it would lay the foundation for the success of the D-Day landings. On this channel, I tell you about history's forgotten heroes. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because this story is too dramatic, too human, and too unforgettable to be taught in schools. Now let's go back to those dark days of 1942. In early 1942, Britain was fighting for its very survival. Germany had occupied all of Western Europe. The Mediterranean was under threat. German U-boats virtually controlled the North Atlantic and were on the verge of starving Britain into submission. German warships stationed at the port of Brest threatened to cut Britain's last link with its colonies. The only bright spot was that the Pearl Harbor attack had brought America into the war, but it would take time for American power to reach Europe. Until then, Britain had to stand alone against Hitler. And Britain had only one offensive weapon at its disposal: RAF Bomber Command. Every night, hundreds of British bombers crossed the English Channel and bombed German targets. These night raids were the only form of offense Britain could mount against Nazi Germany. But there was a problem, a very big problem. British bombers were falling from the sky. Every night, every week, more and more aircraft and crews were being lost. By late 1941, losses had climbed to 4%. That number might sound small to you, but think about it. 1 in every 25 aircraft wasn't coming back, and each crew consisted of 7 men. The math was merciless. Something had changed. The Germans could somehow find British bombers even in complete darkness. Night fighters were attacking British bombers as if they could see in the dark. British intelligence knew the reason: radar. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe. Radar technology was actually a field the British took pride in. During the summer of 1940, in the Battle of Britain, British radar had played a vital role. German aircraft could be detected before they were even visible, allowing RAF fighters to scramble in time. This technological advantage was one of the main reasons Britain was saved from invasion. But now the tables had turned. The Germans had also developed radar, and apparently they had built an even more effective system than the British one. This is where a man enters the scene: Dr. Reginald Victor Jones, Britain's first scientific intelligence officer, a young, brilliant, and extremely determined physicist. Jones had been tracking German radar. He examined downed German aircraft, interrogated prisoners of war, and analyzed information coming from Bletchley Park, where Enigma codes were being decrypted. And finally, he made 2 critical discoveries. First, the Germans were using a long-range early warning radar they called Freya. This system could detect British bomber formations from hundreds of kilometers away. Second, the Germans had developed a second, far more dangerous system called Würzburg. This radar had shorter range, but it was incredibly precise. It could track even a single aircraft, determining its altitude, speed, and direction. And worst of all, these 2 systems worked together. Freya detected enemy aircraft, and Würzburg guided German night fighters directly to their targets, a perfect death trap. A solution had to be found. Jones needed more information about Würzburg, but how? In November 1941, an RAF reconnaissance aircraft photographed something interesting on the northern coast of France. Near the village of Bruneval, on the cliffs overlooking the sea, there was a large parabolic dish, about 3 meters in diameter, metallic, in enemy territory. When Jones examined the photographs, his heart raced. This was the Würzburg radar he'd been looking for, and most importantly, it was in an accessible location, close to the coast, relatively isolated, potentially capturable. But how? Jones had a crazy idea. Steal this radar, literally. Enter France, dismantle the radar, and bring it back to England. The idea was presented to Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, commander of Combined Operations. Mountbatten was in Churchill's inner circle and had a taste for bold operations. He enthusiastically embraced Jones's proposal. But planning the operation wasn't easy. The radar installation at Bruneval was well defended. There were German defensive positions along the coast. A commando raid from the sea would be suicide. The Germans would have enough time to destroy the radar. Mountbatten's solution was audacious. An airborne assault, paratroopers. This would be the first real test for British airborne forces. The 1st Airborne Division had just been formed. Its commander, General Frederick Boy Browning, eagerly accepted the operation. A successful raid would prove the value of paratroopers. The plan began to take shape. Paratroopers would jump at midnight, capture the radar, dismantle the critical components, and be evacuated by sea from the beach. It seemed simple, but nothing in war is simple. Don't forget to subscribe and like for this story. There was a vital element for the operation's success: intelligence. The British needed to know everything about the German forces at Bruneval. How many soldiers were there? Where were they positioned? What were their weapons? Was the beach mined? RAF photographs provided important information, but it wasn't enough. They needed ground-level intelligence, and this is where the French resistance came into play. Gilbert Renaud, codename Remy, was the leader of one of France's most effective resistance networks. The Confrérie Notre Dame covered much of occupied France and Belgium. Renaud was one of the first to answer de Gaulle's call and maintained regular contact with London. In January 1942, the message from London was clear. Detailed information was needed about coastal defenses in the Cap d'Antifer area, specifically machine gun positions, the strength and locations of German units, and the positions of barbed wire. Remy assigned his 2 most experienced agents to the task. The first was Captain Roger Dumont, codename Pole. The second was Charles Chauveau, a Haitian-born mechanic, codename Charlemagne. These 2 brave men, disguised as agricultural engineers, traveled to the Bruneval area. They observed for days. They chatted with German sentries. They recorded the names of officers staying at the village hotel. And most importantly, they examined the beach. They discovered a critical piece of information. The beach was not mined. This information would change the fate of the operation. An unmined beach meant evacuation was possible. But the courage of the French agents would come at a cost. After the operation, the Germans began searching for resistance members who had conducted reconnaissance in Bruneval. One was captured and executed. Another French citizen and his fiancée were deported to concentration camps in Germany for helping surviving British paratroopers. Freedom wasn't cheap, and these nameless heroes remained in the shadows of history. The unit selected for the operation was C Company of the 2nd Parachute Battalion. Interestingly, this company was composed almost entirely of Scots. Tough men from the Black Watch, Cameron Highlanders, King's Own Scottish Borderers, and Seaforth Highlanders. They were called Jock Company. And an English officer was assigned to lead these Scottish warriors, Major John Frost. Frost came from a military family. He was a Sandhurst graduate, he had served in Iraq, and he didn't initially have very positive thoughts about parachuting. He had read about the heavy losses German paratroopers suffered in Crete and considered airborne operations risky. But fate had brought him to the 2nd Parachute Battalion, and now he faced the biggest mission of his life. Frost quickly bonded with C Company. The Scottish accent could be difficult to understand, but their warrior spirit was undeniable. These men were ready to die for each other. For the operation, the company was divided into 5 groups, each named after famous British admirals: Nelson, Jellicoe, Hardy, Drake, and Rodney. Each group had a specific task. The Nelson group would capture the beach and secure the evacuation. Jellicoe, Hardy, and Drake groups would raid the radar installation and the villa. Rodney would form a defensive line as a reserve force against German reinforcements. Frost prepared the plan meticulously. Every man's role was clear. Every movement would be rehearsed. Don't forget to like the video. But the most critical man in the operation was neither a paratrooper nor a commando. His name was Charles Cox, a flight sergeant in the RAF, and one of Britain's best radar technicians. Cox's story is incredible in itself. On February 1, 1942, Cox was going about his routine work when he received a sudden summons. He was ordered to report to the Air Ministry. When he arrived in London, he was directed to Air Commodore Victor Tate's office. Tate got straight to the point. "You volunteered for a dangerous mission." Cox replied in surprise, "I haven't volunteered for anything." Tate smiled. "But you're here now, Sergeant. Will you volunteer?" When Cox asked what he would be volunteering for, he was told it was top secret and couldn't be revealed yet. And so, radar technician Charles Cox found himself at parachute training camp. 6 weeks of training normally required was compressed into 2 weeks. Cox had never jumped with a parachute in his life, but now he would be jumping into enemy territory. When he met Frost and his men, Cox understood that these Scottish soldiers were preparing for some kind of raid, and slowly he grasped what his own role would be. He would dismantle the Würzburg radar, identify the critical components, and prepare them to be brought back to England. Dr. Jones and his team briefed Cox about Würzburg. They explained which parts were most important. A job that would normally take half an hour would need to be done in minutes under enemy fire. It was a very difficult task. And there was another problem. Cox would jump in his RAF uniform. If captured, the Germans would realize he had special expertise, and his interrogation would be much harsher. Jones tried to give Cox an army uniform and false identity, but the War Office refused. So Cox would jump into France in his blue RAF uniform, shirt and tie under his paratrooper coveralls. And a protection unit was assigned to him. Their job was to prevent Cox from falling into enemy hands at all costs. In early February 1942, an intensive training period began. On Salisbury Plain, a full-scale replica of Bruneval was constructed. RAF aerial photographs were used to recreate every detail accurately. The paratroopers trained day and night, jumping, landing, attacking, withdrawing. Every movement was repeated hundreds of times. In Scotland, at Loch Fyne, evacuation rehearsals were conducted with the Royal Navy. Everything seemed perfect until the final rehearsal. February 23, 1942, 4 days before the operation, the final dress rehearsal. A disaster. As the evacuation boats tried to approach the shore, they ran aground. They got stuck on sandbars. The crews couldn't free the boats. In a real operation, this would have meant the destruction of the entire unit. Morale collapsed. Mountbatten and Frost were worried. Should the operation be canceled? But weather conditions were creating pressure. The ideal conditions for the operation would only last a few more days. A full moon was needed for the paratroopers to see, a rising tide was needed for the boats to approach the shore, and calm seas were needed for the evacuation. February 27, 1942, afternoon. At RAF Thruxton Air Base, 12 Armstrong Whitworth Whitley bombers stood ready. These aircraft had been modified to carry paratroopers. At 6:30 p.m., 119 paratroopers began boarding the aircraft. Every man's face was blackened. Heavy equipment, weapons, ammunition, and of course, Cox's toolkit. Cox felt strangely calm as he boarded the aircraft. Perhaps fear disappears after acceptance. During the flight, it said he sang operetta songs to boost the other soldiers' morale. Frost took one last look at his men. These Scottish warriors, thousands of kilometers from home, were about to jump into enemy territory. Some of them wouldn't return. At 10 p.m., the aircraft took off. They glided silently over the English Channel. Lights were off due to blackout regulations. There was no sound except the roar of the engines. As they approached the French coast, German anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. The sky lit up, but the pilots kept their composure. The aircraft flew high to evade the fire. And then the target came into view. Bruneval's snow-covered fields gleamed under the moonlight. 12:15 a.m. The green light came on. The first paratrooper jumped into the void. Friends, this is just the beginning of our story. In the second part, I'll tell you about the 119 paratroopers landing on the snow-covered French soil, the dramatic assault on the radar installation, and Charles Cox's struggle to dismantle the Würzburg under enemy fire. What happened that night is the kind of thing that would make Hollywood films jealous, but this is real. Every second is documented, verified by the testimonies of survivors. If this video caught your interest, please like it and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to turn on notifications, and if you're curious about the continuation of the story, let's move on to part 2 now, if you've subscribed and liked the video. Welcome back to part 2, everyone. We're continuing without a break. In part 1, I told you about how Britain was fighting for survival in those dark days of 1942. RAF bombers were suffering heavy losses every night. Germany's mysterious Würzburg radar was hunting British pilots even in complete darkness. And the British made a bold plan. 119 paratroopers would jump into Bruneval on the northern coast of France, steal the radar, and escape by sea. Now we're diving into the most dramatic hours of that night. If you haven't watched part 1, pause this video and watch it first. It's important for you to fully understand the story. Are you ready? Then let's begin. The night of February 27th, 28th, 1942, 12:15 a.m. The hatches of the Whitley bombers opened. Freezing wind rushed in. Major John Frost looked into the dark void. Below, the French coast stretched out, illuminated by moonlight. The green light came on. Frost threw himself into the void. His parachute opened instantly. The silence was striking. After the roar of the aircraft's engines, there was only the howling of the wind. As he drifted down, Frost looked around. He could recognize the terrain features from the aerial photographs he had studied hundreds of times before. Snow-covered fields, rows of trees, the sea glittering in the distance. And then his feet touched the ground. The soft snow cushioned the landing. It muffled the sound. Frost quickly gathered his parachute. He checked his knife and .45 caliber American pistol. Everything was in place. Around him, other paratroopers were also landing, dark silhouettes like shadows falling on the white snow. Equipment containers had landed with them too. And then something unexpected happened. When Frost and his men gathered at the drop zone, they faced a peculiar reality. Everyone needed to use the bathroom. During the flight, they had drunk gallons of tea to ward off the freezing cold, and now, in enemy territory, their bladders were about to burst. Frost thought for a moment. Every second of the operation was critical, but his men were uncomfortable. They couldn't concentrate. He gave the order for a short break. And so, one of history's boldest raids began with a group bathroom break in a snow-covered French field. This detail might seem funny to you, but this is the reality of war. Heroes are human too. They get hungry, they get thirsty, they need the bathroom, and sometimes, even at the most critical moments, nature calls. After the break, Frost gathered his men. The plan was starting to work. But the first problem had also emerged. Nelson Group was missing. This group was tasked with capturing the beach. It was critical for the evacuation, but something had gone wrong during the jump. One of the pilots had miscalculated the drop zone. Half of Nelson Group had jumped 3 kilometers south of the target. In the dark, in snowy terrain, they didn't even know where they were. Frost didn't know this. His radios weren't working. They really weren't working. This wouldn't be the first time in Frost's career. 2.5 years later, he would face the same problem at Arnhem. But for now, Frost had to make do with what he had. Don't forget to subscribe and like. Jellicoe, Hardy, and Drake groups had landed at full strength. Rodney Group was also in position. The main assault force was ready. Frost gave the order: advance to target. North of Bruneval village, on the cliffs overlooking the English Channel, there was a villa. The French called it Manoir des Falaises, the mansion of the cliffs. And right near this villa, at the edge of the cliff, stood the Würzburg radar, a large parabolic dish, the eye of German air defense. Frost and his men advanced silently. The snow swallowed their footsteps. The moonlight provided sufficient visibility, but that same moonlight also made them visible. As they advanced, Frost reviewed the assignments one last time. Hardy Group, including Frost himself and radar technician Cox, would capture the villa. Jellicoe Group, under Lieutenant Peter Young's command, would attack the radar directly. Drake Group would engage the German garrison at the farm called Le Presbytère, buying time for the assault team. Everything depended on speed. They had to dismantle the radar and reach the beach before the Germans could call for reinforcements. Around 12:30 a.m., the villa came into view, a dark silhouette against the snow cover. Frost gave the signal. The assault began. Hardy Group approached the villa silently. The door wasn't locked. Frost and his men burst inside. Inside, there was a handful of German soldiers. Most were asleep. Radio operators were on night duty. The firefight was brief. The British paratroopers were trained and determined. Firearms spoke. Grenades exploded. Within minutes, the villa was captured. 3 Germans were taken prisoner. One of them was of critical importance. He was a radar technician. The capture of this technician was an unexpected bonus of the operation. After returning to England, this man would be interrogated and provide valuable information about Würzburg. But while the villa was being captured, the main target was still outside. Jellicoe Group, under Peter Young's command, attacked the radar installation directly. The Würzburg stood a few hundred meters north of the villa, right at the cliff's edge. There were protective trenches and guard huts around it, but the intensity of the assault caught the German sentries off guard. Young's men quickly captured the positions. After a brief firefight, the radar installation was under British control, and now it was Charles Cox's moment. When Cox stood before the Würzburg, he was facing something he had dreamed of for years: the enemy's eye, the device that hunted British pilots in the dark. Under the moonlight, the parabolic dish looked enormous, about 3 meters in diameter, a metal structure, control cabins, cables, electronic components. Cox's task was clear: take this monster apart and remove the most critical components. Under normal circumstances, this job would take half an hour, carefully unscrewing bolts, disconnecting cables, removing delicate electronic parts. But Cox didn't have half an hour, he had minutes, and bullets were whistling around him. Because the German garrison at Les Presbytères farm had awakened, and they were firing. Drake Group's task was to engage the approximately 100 German soldiers at Les Presbytères, and they fulfilled this task heroically. 10 men under Lieutenant Peter Naumoff's command formed a defensive line against dozens of German soldiers. They opened fire, threw grenades, kept the Germans' attention away from the radar installation. But the Germans were returning fire too. Machine gun fire was tearing up the ground around the villa and radar installation. Bullets were melting the snow. Cox was working in the middle of this hell. He opened his toolkit and experienced his first shock. The screwdriver needed for the screws was too short. It couldn't reach the deep sockets of the Würzburg. This could have been a disaster. The entire operation could have failed because of a screwdriver. But Cox didn't give up. Lieutenant Dennis Vernon from the Royal Engineers and his team were with him. Vernon thought quickly. He pulled out crowbars, chisels, and hammers, and Cox turned the delicate electronics job into a brute force operation. Cox ripped off the Würzburg's covers. He forced parts out of place. He broke screws. He cut cables. Following the instructions Dr. Jones had given him, he identified the most critical components: the receiver unit, the control panel, the frequency modulator. As he removed each part, he was under fire. Bullets were hitting the metal body, but Cox didn't break his concentration. At one point, Frost came to Cox's side. "How much longer?" he asked. Cox, his hands covered in blood and grease, replied without looking up, "A few more minutes." Those few minutes felt like an eternity. Frost was growing worried as the gunfire around them intensified. German reinforcements were on their way. The sound of vehicle engines could be heard in the distance, and Nelson Group was still nowhere to be found. The status of the beach was unknown. The radios weren't working. Everything was on a knife's edge. Meanwhile, what were the Germans experiencing? In the first minutes of the raid, the German garrison at Les Presbytères was in shock. Paratroopers suddenly appearing in the middle of the night was a completely unexpected situation. But the Germans quickly recovered. The troops at Les Presbytères armed themselves and began advancing toward the radar installation. More importantly, calls for reinforcements had been made. Armored units a few kilometers inland had been alerted. Trucks were loading soldiers, heading toward Bruneval. Frost was running out of time, and he knew it. Don't forget to subscribe and like. Finally, Cox removed the last piece. In his hands was the heart of the Würzburg, the receiver unit, frequency control, signal processor, the components Dr. Jones wanted most. The Royal Engineers loaded the parts onto specially designed folding carts. These carts had been dropped with the parachutes and were designed precisely for a moment like this. Cox took a last look at the Würzburg. This device that had once been a death machine for British pilots was now a half-dismantled wreck. The mission was complete. But the journey home would be harder than the journey there. Frost gave the order, "Withdraw." It was past 2 a.m. More than 2 hours had passed. German reinforcements could arrive at any moment. Jellicoe, Hardy, and Drake groups left the villa with the radar parts and prisoners. They began advancing toward the beach. But just then, German soldiers reoccupied the villa. Reinforcements from the southern garrison had entered the emptied building. When Frost looked back, he saw fire coming from the villa. The Germans were trying to shoot the retreating British. The situation was critical. Ahead of them, an unknown beach. Behind them, a firing enemy. Frost led his men to the edge of the cliffs. Below, Bruneval Beach stretched out. A small cove, rocky terrain, the freezing waters of the channel. But the beach wasn't secure yet. Half of Nelson Group, remember, had jumped in the wrong place. The German positions on the beach were still active. A concrete bunker controlled the beach. Machine guns were sweeping the path above the cliffs. Frost tried to signal the Navy by radio. He failed. The radios still weren't working. The plan was this. When the beach was secure, they would fire a signal flare and the naval boats waiting at sea would approach the shore. But the beach wasn't secure and they couldn't communicate with the Navy. Frost had to make a critical decision. Frost ordered Rodney Group and the Nelson soldiers he had available, take the beach. This wasn't an easy task. The path from the cliff to the beach was under German fire. The machine gun in the bunker was tracking every movement. But just then, unexpected help arrived. The missing half of Nelson Group had finally found the right way. They had walked through snowy terrain for 3 kilometers, following the sound of gunfire. And now they were approaching from beside the beach, from behind the German bunker. The German bunker was caught between 2 fires. Frost's men from the front, Nelson Group from behind. The firefight was short and violent. Grenades exploded. The machine gun fell silent. The beach had been captured. 2:15 a.m. Frost stood on the beach and looked out at the sea. The dark waters glittered under the moonlight. But the naval boats were nowhere in sight. The plan was for the boats to approach when the beach was secure, but the boats hadn't received a signal because the radios weren't working. As a last resort, Frost had a signal flare fired. A red light illuminated the night sky. And then he waited. Minutes passed like an eternity. The Germans continued firing from the villa and surrounding areas. Bullets were hitting the rocks on the beach. Frost began thinking about the worst-case scenario. What if the Navy didn't come? What if they were trapped here on this narrow strip of beach? Enemy behind him, freezing sea in front, over 100 men, radar parts and prisoners, and nowhere to retreat. And then, out of the darkness, shadows appeared. 6 landing craft assault vessels, LCAs, were approaching the shore. The Royal Navy had arrived. But why so late? It was later learned that the naval forces had been dealing with their own problems. A German naval patrol had nearly discovered them. They had been forced to hide for hours, and they had received no signal from the radios. Only when they saw the signal flare could they move into action. As the boats approached the shore, another problem arose. German fire had intensified. Fire was being directed at the boats from positions above the cliffs. But this time, the Navy returned fire. The soldiers on the LCAs, men from the South Wales Borderers and Royal Fusiliers, raised their weapons. They opened heavy fire on the German positions above the cliffs. And under this suppressing fire, the paratroopers began boarding the boats. Frost loaded the wounded first. Several men had been injured during the operation. Their safety was the priority. Then the prisoners boarded. The German radar technician, hands bound, was guided onto a boat with a bewildered expression. And most importantly, the radar parts. Cox and the engineers carefully loaded their precious loot. These parts were the entire purpose of the operation. They couldn't be lost. Cox boarded one of the first boats. His knowledge was too valuable. Him falling into enemy hands was absolutely unacceptable. Frost was one of the last men to board. As a commander, he wanted to make sure everyone had departed safely. But not everyone could depart. 6 men were missing. They had become separated from the group during the fighting, or they had been wounded and couldn't be carried. In any case, the boats couldn't wait for them. Frost faced a painful decision. Waiting longer would put the entire unit in danger. German reinforcements could reach the beach at any moment. The boats left the shore. Those 6 men were left behind. They would later be taken prisoner by the Germans. They would spend the rest of the war in prisoner of war camps. But 113 men, along with the radar parts and 3 German prisoners, were going home. When the LCAs reached open water, they transferred to larger motorboats. These motor gunboats were faster and more durable. Cox and the radar parts were loaded onto the fastest boat. This boat immediately set off toward England. The scientists were waiting impatiently. The other boats followed in convoy. The return journey wasn't as calm as expected. The sea had roughened. Waves were rocking the boats, and Cox, along with many others, succumbed to seasickness. There was also constant anxiety. German naval and air forces could attack at any moment. Stukas or submarines could be deadly for small boats. But as dawn broke, help arrived. As they approached the British coast, familiar silhouettes appeared in the sky. RAF Spitfires. Friendly fighter aircraft had come to escort the convoy. And at sea, 4 British destroyers had taken up protective duty. 4 light destroyers from the Free French forces were also accompanying them. The German threat had been neutralized. The return journey was secured. February 28, 1942, morning hours. Entering Portsmouth Harbor, the men on the boats were tired but victorious. When Frost came up on deck, he saw the crowd waiting on shore. Officers, journalists, even high-ranking officials. The operation was a success. The operation's toll was as follows. British casualties, 2 dead, 8 wounded, 6 captured. German casualties, 5 dead, 2 Army, 3 Luftwaffe, several wounded, 3 captured. And the gains? Critical components of the Würzburg radar, a German radar technician, and priceless intelligence. These numbers show how well planned and executed the operation was. Achieving such a great success with such low casualties in a raid into enemy territory is rare in military history. Subscribe and like the video for these heroics. News of the operation spread quickly. On March 3, 1942, Prime Minister Winston Churchill convened the War Cabinet. A special session was arranged, and to this session, Major John Frost and other officers who participated in the operation were invited. Churchill personally listened to Frost and his men. He wanted to learn every detail of the operation: the parachute jump, the Villa Raid, the dismantling of the radar, the beach firefight, the sea evacuation. Churchill's eyes were shining. This kind of bold operation spoke to his spirit. Since Dunkirk, Britain had won a concrete victory on enemy soil for the first time, and Churchill now fully understood the value of paratroopers. On May 15, 1942, a special supplement was published in the London Gazette. 19 medals were awarded. Major John Frost was awarded the Military Cross. His brave leadership and composure at critical moments were recognized. Flight Sergeant Charles Cox received the Military Medal. Under enemy fire, he had completed a job that would normally take half an hour in just minutes. Naval Commander Frederick Cook was honored with the Distinguished Service Cross. Among other medals were 2 more DSCs, 2 Distinguished Service Medals, 1 more Military Cross, 2 more military medals, and 9 mentions in dispatches. Additionally, Wing Commander Charles Pickard, who directed the air portion of the operation, was awarded a bar to his Distinguished Service Order. These medals represented not just individual courage, but the extraordinary performance of the entire unit. There's a small anecdote in Charles Cox's story. After returning to England, Cox went to a tailor. He wanted to buy a military medal ribbon. He was going to put it on his uniform. The tailor noticed Cox's RAF uniform, and he was surprised, because the military medal was usually given to the Army. "This medal is for the Army," said the tailor. "What did you do to earn this?" Cox shrugged. "Nothing much," he said. And that was it. This modesty sums up Cox's character. He had played a critical role in one of history's boldest raids. Under enemy fire, he had stolen the technology Britain needed most, and he brushed it off as nothing much. After the war, Cox opened a small electrical shop in Würzburg. And guess what? He kept the inadequate screwdriver he used at Brunel. That screwdriver stayed in his shop until the end of his life. So what happened to the radar parts? The components Cox dismantled were immediately delivered to British scientists. Dr. R.V. Jones and his team examined these parts for days, and what they discovered was both reassuring and critical. The reassuring part, the Würzburg wasn't as advanced as they had thought. It had a modular design, yes, but its basic technology wasn't very different from British radar. The critical part, the Würzburg's operating frequency was identified. This was vital for developing countermeasures. The interrogation of the captured German technician also provided valuable information. The man described Würzburg's strengths and weaknesses, and all this information formed the foundation for the next phase. The intelligence obtained from Brunel accelerated a project called Window. Window was a simple but ingenious idea: thin aluminum strips. When these strips were dropped from aircraft, they caused false echoes on radar screens. A handful of aluminum strips would appear to a radar operator like a giant aircraft fleet. Since the frequency of the Würzburg at Bruneval was known, it could be calculated exactly what length the strips needed to be cut: half a wavelength, approximately 27 centimeters. But Window wasn't used immediately. There was a paradox. If the British used Window, the Germans could copy this technique and use it against British radars. During the Battle of Britain, this could have been disastrous. But by 1943, the situation had changed. German air attacks had decreased, British radars were more advanced, and RAF bomber losses were still very high. July 1943, Hamburg. Operation Gomorrah. Window was used on a large scale for the first time. Do you like this story? If so, like and subscribe. Thank you. The night of July 24, 1943, hundreds of RAF bombers were flying toward Hamburg. And this time, they had a new weapon with them. The bombers were dropping window strips every minute. Thousands, tens of thousands of aluminum strips scattered through the night sky. When German radar operators looked at their screens, they were shocked. The screens were flooded with meaningless echoes. It was impossible to distinguish real aircraft from false signals. The Würzburg system had gone completely blind. Night fighters couldn't find their targets. Anti-aircraft batteries were forced to fire randomly. Searchlights searched the sky in vain. And the RAF bombers hit Hamburg almost without hindrance. That night, only 12 bombers were lost, far below the normal loss rate. The week-long Hamburg bombings were one of the most devastating air raids in history. And at the foundation of this success were the radar parts stolen from Bruneval. The effects of the Bruneval Raid weren't limited to Window. The operation's success changed the future of British airborne forces. Churchill and the War Cabinet now fully understood the value of paratroopers. In April 1942, the Airborne Forces Depot and Battle School was established in Derbyshire. In August 1942, the Parachute Regiment was officially formed. Many infantry battalions were converted to airborne battalions. These decisions were of critical importance for D-Day. On June 6, 1944, the first to set foot in Normandy were paratroopers, and their presence played a decisive role in the success of the landings. Bruneval's legacy lived on the beaches of Normandy. Now let's step back and look at the big picture. In February 1942, 119 men risked their lives for a single radar component. And this courage caused a chain reaction. The radar parts enabled the development of Window technology. Window dramatically reduced RAF bomber losses. Fewer losses meant more intensive bombing. More intensive bombing weakened German industrial capacity. Weakening industry reduced German strength on the front lines. And the operation itself proved the value of airborne forces. More paratroopers were trained. More airborne operations were planned. In Normandy, these forces took on vital roles. A single night, a single raid, a single radar, and history changed. In telling this story, I want to particularly highlight some names. John Frost. This man who began his career at Bruneval would later become a legend at Arnhem Bridge. That bridge bears his name today, John Frost Bridge. Charles Cox, the modest radar technician. He never sought great fame. He lived in his small shop with his old screwdriver. Gilbert Renault, codename Remy, the brave agent of the French resistance. He provided vital intelligence about Bruneval. After the war, he wrote his memoirs and was remembered as a French hero. And the Nameless, the Nelson Group soldiers who jumped in the wrong place but still captured the beach. Drake Group, who held off dozens of Germans at Les Presbytères. The French resistance member who was captured and executed after the operation. These people were the small cogs of great history, but without them, great history couldn't have been written. Friends, we've reached the end of part 2 of this story. In the third and final part, I'll tell you about the long-term effects of the Bruneval Raid, John Frost's final battle at Arnhem, and this operation's legacy that extends to the present day. And I leave you with a question. What other small operations in history do you think led to great consequences? If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss part 3. Let's move on to the final part right now. Now we're in the final part. I've been telling this incredible story for 2 parts. 119 paratroopers jumped into France for a single radar component. They dismantled the radar under enemy fire, and they changed history. Now, in this final part, I'll tell you about the long-term effects of this raid and the fate of its heroes. Bruneval was just the beginning for John Frost. After 1942, Frost fought in North Africa and Italy. He proved his leadership abilities in every operation. But the real legend was written on September 17, 1944. Arnhem, Operation Market Garden. Frost captured Arnhem Bridge with 745 men, and for 4 days he held out against vastly superior German forces until the ammunition ran out, until the last bullet was fired. He was wounded, taken prisoner, but he never gave up. Today that bridge bears his name, John Frost Bridge. The journey that began at Bruneval reached its peak at Arnhem. The radar parts stolen from Bruneval saved thousands of lives. Window technology protected RAF bombers from 1943 onward. Hamburg, Berlin, Cologne. In every major raid, aluminum strips blinded German radars. Estimated figures show this. Window saved approximately 800 bomber crews, more than 5,000 airmen. And on D-Day, Window was used in deception operations. False fleet images were created. The Germans couldn't figure out where the landings would take place. Bruneval's legacy lived on the beaches of Normandy. The village of Bruneval still stands today, a small, quiet French coastal town. On the cliffs, there are 2 memorials. One was unveiled by General de Gaulle in 1947. The other is larger, more impressive. Every year, British paratroopers visit these memorials. C Company of the 2nd Parachute Battalion still carries the name Bruneval Company to this day. Even 80 years later, that night has not been forgotten. What do we learn from this story? Sometimes the things that change history aren't great armies or giant weapons. Sometimes it's 119 brave men and a single radar component. Sometimes heroes are humble people, like a technician who kept his old screwdriver in his small shop. And sometimes the boldest moves made in the darkest moments illuminate the future. The Bruneval Raid is proof of this. Friends, we've reached the end of this 3-part series. If you enjoyed this story, which other World War II operations would you like me to cover? Let me know in the comments. And finally, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. I'll be back in the next video with a new story of a forgotten hero. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye. See you soon.